Hi there, everyone. My name's Noah. I'm presenting on the accessible generation of EMS training scenarios, and I'd like to give special thanks to my advisors, Dr. Godley and Emma Gauss, both over at the School of Public Health. So, if you saw me during the half point in December, I had a very different plan. At that point, we were going to be doing a big data research on the impact of climate change, specifically heat emergencies, on EMS call volumes. So basically taking a look at if there are heat spikes in a given area, does that affect the number of emergencies that there are in that area and how we can allocate resources to take care of that. There were two main steps to this. So the first one was a national time series analysis where we were going to look at the cases kind of stratified by geography. And then the secondary analysis was local and socioeconomic, figuring out if communities with less resources fared worse inside of these emergencies. Unfortunately, I got a little bit of a surprise in late February or so, where the national organization that kind of manages this data kind of ceased to exist. Or at least they were severely defunded to the point that they could no longer support research. So this involved a pretty big pivot. So the reason that I did this project in the first place, tried to do that large-scale analysis, was because of the time that I've spent as an EMT, both on the ambulance and in the emergency room, noticing kind of what happened to my patients during climate emergencies. The other part of my time in EMS has been as an educator. I'm currently the training coordinator over at Boston University's EMS program, so I tried to look at the education side of things and figure out how we can make that a little bit better. So at the national scale, there is a massive, terrifying staffing emergency inside of EMS, which is emergency medical services. There are about 1/3 of EMTs who quit during the COVID-19 pandemic. About 66% of these emergency medical agencies have reported worse staffing and lower application numbers. And then about half of these agencies have had actual physical, tangible consequences as a result. Meaning, in these municipalities where we have low staffing, Boston's pretty safe, but around the rest of the country, there are places where if you call 911, it's going to be a significantly longer time to get help than you would have had a couple years back. So the reason, or one of the big reasons that this is so scary, or that this is such a challenge to get folks in the field, is because there are a bunch of steps involved with the application. So you need to first take your class, you need to pass a state psychomotor exam, you need to pass a national written exam, and then you can get your NREMT certification and celebrate and actually go work in the fields. But in that vein, the big thing that I'm going to try and focus on is that state psychomotor exam, which is one of the more intensive and scary processes that these EMT students can go about. As for what that actually looks like, we're going to focus on two specific scenarios in that. The little gasps are good. That's what I was going for. These are the flow charts that we've got for the patient analysis, and then an example of a possible training scenario. And what these EMTs have to do on their exams is they need to show the proper assessment and treatment of a medical and then trauma patient, both in under 10 minutes. That's what the huge flow chart over there is. And then the scenarios that we train on and you're actually tested with at the national level are closer. It's like the black and white piece of paper on this side. That said, there are a lot of issues in getting access to these training scenarios. BU has a pretty good system where we distribute them throughout the class and then you can access them at the ends, but a lot of training organizations don't really have any, and once you blow through the ones provided by your training organization, there's basically no resources online. There are a few compilations, they're all either outdated or very, very expensive though. So the goal for this project was to make these scenarios easier, to improve pass rates on the psychomotor exam, and eventually create more EMTs who are able to work in the fields. So as for how we actually did this, I'm going to see if there we go. Oh my gosh, it actually works. So the intervention here, I coded a mobile application that's able to kind of procedurally generate these training scenarios, both for medical and trauma patients. It works mostly on iOS devices, although I'm trying to work to change that. And it has, again, stuff for both our medical and our trauma exams. I have kind of tailored the sort of scenarios that we're going to see on there to focus on ones that include medications, as these tend to be the most challenging ones for students. That's where we see the lowest pass rate. So the current medical scenarios that we've got built in are anaphylaxis, reactive airway disorders like asthma, some sort of acute coronary syndrome like a heart attack, narcotics overdose, and stroke. And then there are randomly generated trauma scenarios that it builds out for you too. And what you're seeing here is the basic outline of the app. You've got nothing at the start, then it generates your scenario broken into those boxes that we saw on the earlier slide. And you can work with a partner to walk through that scenario and get practice for your state psychomotor exam, which is exciting. So why this can continue to function over time, and one of the other downsides to static resources is that parts of every single patient assessment are randomly generated. It's not just there's a assessment written in there that's this person's having a heart attack. Instead, components of the patient assessment for every single scenario will be different. For example, on one scenario where they're complaining about chest pain, they might say, oh, my chest really hurts. And on the other one, they'll say, it feels like something's crushing my chest. It feels like there's an elephant standing on it. In addition to randomly generated vitals, history, allergies, and other components of the patient's like medical history that you go through in the interview to make sure that these stay fresh. So even though there are only like 7 categories of medical assessment that are tested on the exam and the trauma assessment, there are functionally an infinite amount of scenarios that you can walk through by using these 7 different categories. So the goal here at the end of the day is to make sure that we have students who can practice on this for a longer period of time and become comfortable with the assessments and therefore more able to pass their exam. So this is the intervention that we've come up with. As for where we're going in the future with this, there are some next steps. First off, I want to add more to our trauma scenarios. Right now, it's focused mostly on life-threatening injuries. That's not representative of what's seen in the field, although it is, pretty similar to what you're seeing on the exams. So I want to add more nuance and smaller injuries to these. I am fortunate enough to have some of my students from the Brandeis section this semester actually working through the app right now and testing it to find, the many mistakes that I made. And I'm going to be pushing it out to my BU students after their final exam too. So we've got a bunch of EMTs who are getting their hands on this. I'm excited to say that it functions properly, as you can see here. It was exciting when I got Xcode to finally stop crashing on my computer, but it is not the most visually enticing thing that you've ever seen. So one of the other big goals that I've got moving forward is to build out the visual appeal and accessibility. That means adding some sort of coloration to the main page, making sure that there are accessibility functions for the text, and including a settings page where people are able to choose which sort of scenarios they want to test on. And then more ambitious things. There are 2 big progress steps that I'm working on. One would be a hover to discover feature, where different pieces of medical terminology, like anaphylaxis or drugs such as nitroglycerin, you can tap on it to get information on dosing and whatnot outside of the treatment section. And then finally, a end goal for this would be a guided section where you can work through this with the mobile application and not need a partner to run through the scenario with. But these are all things that are going to be happening moving forward. I'm fortunate enough to have more students coming in over the summer who are going to test it, and yeah, that's the plan. All right. So what questions do you have?
I guess I'm really curious about how you're generating the things. Is it just sort of a database of all the, I don't even know, is there an official database of them, or yeah, I'm curious how you generate the scenarios.
Yeah, of course. So can I go back a little bit? Inside of the categories that we've got on side of this massive scary flowchart, the ones that are randomly iterated, either I have stories built in where it's selecting from one of the preset stories that I built out, or for things like vitals and allergies or medications, it's connecting to another database that has a list of the most common medications provided to patients, or for vitals, I know what accurate vitals are within a certain range for a given condition, so it's a randomly generated number inside of that range. So it should kind of build on itself each time. Of course. Anything else?
Great job, Noah. Sorry for coming in a little bit late.
You're good.
So sometimes students face barriers, just like the ones you faced, and have to pivot, and sometimes get stuck. So let's say you were a Kilachand advisor, for example, and you had a student like this, like yourself, who faced a barrier. What advice would you give? Because you showed, in my opinion, remarkable resilience and strength in continuing to be upbeat and continuing to move forward and change your project as you had to. I'm still in awe of how did you do that? What advice would you give to another student who ran into barriers?
I appreciate it. The big thing is I was still digging into the same core subject that I was interested in. So the first one was on EMS. I had a bunch of experience that I pulled from. This was just a different section of it. Specific to the project, I was fortunate enough to have people in my life who'd done something similar. For example, data science projects, or a couple people who've built out mobile applications in the past. So when I was trying to learn how to do this stuff, I had folks that I could lean on. So think about what you were doing initially for the project and why you cared about it, and then lean on your friends, loved ones, people in your life in order to try and get there. All right, thank you all so much.